In this tutorial we will make tailor's hem. It's very helpful ironing tool. Let's start with making a pattern. For making a pattern you will need some kind of paper. It can be just paper for printer. I had on hand graph paper and it's easier to determine right angles, to measure and to draw this kind of paper. But you can use any paper that is big enough for your pattern that you have on hand. First, you need to choose dimensions for your tailor's hem. Mine will be 24 centimeters long and 12 centimeters wide in the widest point, because tailor's hem is narrower on one end and wider on the other. The most common dimensions for tailor's hem vary from 23 to 31 centimeters long and 10 to 18 centimeters wide. For drawing I use hard pencil, it's 4H. I start making my pattern with sketching an outline rectangle. This rectangle will be same dimensions as my tailor's hem, so it's 12 centimeters wide and 24 centimeters long. Then I mark center line. And 1/3 of length, where will be the widest point of my tailor's hem. Then we'll sketch whole shape of our tailor's hem. And for that you can use compass, but I personally prefer to use sewing curve ruler. I start sketching from the widest point to the back. I try to accommodate ruler to the shape that I assumed for my tailor's hem. Generally, back part is wider. It's only curved on the edges and the curve is much sharper in the front. You don't have to draw whole shape at once. As you can see, I do short lines and then I adjust to make shape that I find better for tailor's hem. I prefer for tracing pattern on the fabric to have this line of the pattern without seam allowance, because it will show me stitching line, and then I add seam allowance that I cut my pattern out of the fabric. And then I sketch line from narrower part to the widest point. As you can see, I sketch by accommodating ruler to the shape I have in mind. It will be very difficult to make two exact shapes, and because of that I do not draw on the other part of pattern, but later we will just copy this shape on the other part. And then more adjustments, because it wasn't exactly what I wanted, and smoothing the line, because pencil makes very thin line, and also I have few lines in some points. I take marker pen and make this final shape bolder with it. endless stroke with help of my ruler. And I also embolden the center line. As I will make two covers for my tailor's hem, one will be cut with straight grain and the other will be cut on the bias. And because of that, I make two arrows for those directions of cutting. I use protractor on my ruler. For cutting on the bias, I mark 45 degrees. If you are not familiar with working on the bias, you can skip this and just make two covers cut with straight grain line and another arrow for cutting with straight grain line. Then on the part of the pattern that I didn't sketch anything, I cut out this outline rectangle. And on the other part, I cut out exact pattern. Then I fold my pattern on the center line and I can copy pattern shape on the other part. I decided to do it by cutting only because it's not complicated shape. I don't have to trace anything. If you like, you can do it, but because of its simplicity, you don't have to. You can just cut it out. And this way our pattern is ready. Because your tailor's hem will be exposed a lot of wetness and heat, sometimes really high temperatures, you need to pre-shrink your fabric. The most sure way to do it is to wash your fabric in temperature that it will be washed later and to iron it with highest temperature that you will use on that fabric. As it will be ironing tool, you need it to be resistant for highest possible temperatures on your iron. So it should be cotton, on even better, more heat resistant linen. Mine is cotton unbleached canvas. It's called calico. It's quite strong, temperature resistant and tightly woven that nothing will fall from my hem. For tracing and cutting it out, I fold my fabric into layers with grain line right sides together because first we will work on the left side of the fabric. Make sure that the layers lay flat and smooth and fabric is folded exactly with the grain line. I put my pattern on the fabric with the straight grain line and to leave enough space for seam allowance. Mine will be 1.5 to 2 centimeters wide. And I weight down my pattern with old candle holders. Choose your tool for tracing the pattern. The most often I use tailor's chalk, but on such bright color I prefer to use soft pencil 6 or 8B because it leaves more visible marks. To make sure that layers of the fabric won't shift during tracing the pattern, I pin them together. And then I trace my pattern. Then I take my pattern off and also I pin layers together inside of the traced shape. It will help me with sewing. And also I take pins off that could be obstacles during cutting out. And then I cut out my pattern, adding seam allowance. I don't need exact seam allowance as I have my stitching line, so I do it to my eye. And also later we will trim the seam allowance, so it doesn't need to be very exact measurement, but of course if you want you can do it precisely with a ruler or measuring tape of any device that you use for adding seam allowance. And then I smooth the edge a little bit. And now I will cut the outer cover on the bias. As I said before, if you are not familiar with working on the bias, you can just cut out another cover with straight grain line, but I wanted mine to be on the bias because it will accommodate better to the shape of tailor's hem. But first I needed to prepare my fabric for that. Apart from that, it's also pre-shrunk, I had to hang this out with weights overnight. I determined the true bias of the fabric. As weights, I used pincer clips. I pinned one to hold whole fabric, put on that hook, and on the edge I pinned pincer clips to weight it down, that everything what has to stretch will stretch, and then fabric will be ready to work with on the bias. Then I do almost everything as with previous cover. I fold my fabric, right sides together, and I put my pattern. That arrow made for cutting on the bias will be parallel with straight grain line. Leave enough space for seam allowance. And I weight down my pattern. To make sure that layers of the fabric won't shift during tracing the pattern, I pin them together. And then I trace my pattern. Then I take my pattern off, and also I pin layers together inside of the traced shape. And then I cut out my pattern, adding seam allowance. I do it to my eye. Now we will do basting. It will be helpful with closing this tailor's hem. I make basting with sewing machine and I do it on the wider side of the cover. Set your stitch length for the longest possible straight stitch, as we have pinned together 2 layers of the fabric, but we want to make basting only on 1 layer. So to don't unpin them, that everything for sewing it together later is in place, I just fold this bottom layer that it won't be under the needle, but I don't unpin them. It isn't shown very well, but if you look closely you can see that this bottom layer is folded. I've done basting on this whole curve at wider side. Remember that you don't do any back stitching when you baste, because it's temporary stitch. It will be only helpful for closing your tailor's hem, but it won't stay in that. If you do back stitching, you won't be able to use it as it was meant to be used. And because on the other layer I don't have tracing line, I pin pattern to this layer this layer only, that edge of the pattern will be exact with the stitching line or tracing line on the other layer. It will help us with sewing on the exact same place on the other layer without need of tracing it to this layer. Remember to sew very precisely, as close to the edge of the pattern as possible, but do not catch your pattern with the needle. To baste, I use contrasting threads because they will be very visible and I won't confuse it with regular thread. If it will be visible on the right side in some places, I will have to pick it out and I don't want to confuse it with regular seam. And remember, don't do back stitching or don't tie threads together. Cut threads, leaving approximately 10 to 15 centimeters of thread. And we will do the same on the other cover. And here you can see two layers basted separately. Now for sewing regular seam, change length of the stitch to 1.5 millimeter. You can even do it as short as 1 millimeter because we want to have really close stitching. Why? Because later when we will put filler in, we want anything to fall out of the tailor's hem, and for that such short stitching is the best. Start stitching with back stitch. It will secure your seam. Try to sew on marked stitching line and remember that sewing is not a race. Sew in your own pace and also don't pull fabric under the needle. It's job of feed dog. Only what you should do is to accommodate your fabric right and left by hands, especially on the curved places. Start sewing in place when your basting line is finished. Finish sewing before your basting line starts and remember to finish your seam with back stitching. And then put your presser foot up, make sure that your needle is in the highest position because otherwise you won't be able to pull threads out of the machine, and cut your threads. And then do the same seam on the other cover. Start stitching with back stitch. It will secure your seam. Try to sew on marked stitching line. Whenever you need to realign something, make sure that your needle is in the fabric and just stop sewing. Elevate pressing foot, change direction of the fabric, put your presser foot down and keep sewing. Finish sewing before your basting line starts and remember to finish your seam with back stitching. After finished sewing, I press covers to flat threads between layers of the fabric. Then I trim seam allowance to reduce bulk in my covers. I will cut to make them half as wide as they were before sewing. And then I make notches. They are small triangles cut out from the seam allowance to remove excess fabric. Notches are made on inward curves. They are made to avoid any wrinkles or bulk in seams. They help to lay seam allowance flat and smooth. Be careful and don't accidentally cut your seam. It shouldn't catch sewing line. It should end a little before your seam. I make notches with gaps 2 or 3 centimeters long. Make it on curved places, on inward curves of both sides of the cover. And then I repeat trimming and notching on the other cover. And now I turn the cover's right sides out. To push edges out, I help myself flat-ended wire. Such tool helps a lot with turning not only hem covers, but also other things with closed profiles. Then I press covers to smooth everything what creased during turning right side out, and also to stabilize the seam and whole shape of the cover. First I iron one side of the covers, then I leave it to cool down. It helps to hold shape better. Then I turn it to the other side and press it. For tailor's hem filling, I used oak sawdust. Why sawdust and not, for example, remnant fabrics? Well, because it has proper density, it compresses over time. It also absorbs heat and moisture very well. If you struggle to find oak sawdust, you can ask your local carpenter for that. Sometimes they will give it even for free. I have my sawdust in 2 different granularities. One is thicker, sometimes even I can feel small parts of wood, and another is much lighter from different stages of woodwork. And it turned out that this lighter, thinner type is better because I can pack it more firmly, that it's easier to squeeze it in hand, and it leaves less visible structure when it's packed in cover. You need to pack your sawdust very, very firmly. And for my tailor's hem, 24 centimeters long and 12 centimeters wide, I used 200 grams of oak sawdust to fill my whole hem. To make putting sawdust in cover easier, I made funnel from paper. It's helpful especially as you begin because it's easier to put sawdust in the end of cover. Don't put too much at once because it makes kind of ball of sawdust that can't go through funnel and through cover, and it will stop some. You can also help yourself with, as I do it, with some kind of wooden masher or something like that. I used for this wooden spoon that this part of spoon is cut off. knife, and I use it as a pressing tool, and it also was helpful in this case. Filling your tailor's hem with sawdust can be a little bit messy, so if you want to avoid dirty floor, you can do it outside. Keep packing your sawdust into cover until it's full to the place when basting starts. And we will start closing opening. First I prepare thread for hand sewing. I will sew with single thread and I cut it a little bit longer than my forearm. To prevent threads tangling and knotting, let's wax it. Take the wax and pull the end of the thread through the wax 3 or 4 times. Then do the same of the rest of thread. To distribute wax evenly on the thread, we will press it. Put thread in 2 layers of paper. I use baking paper. Take warm iron, but not too hot, only warm enough to melt the wax. And holding weight of iron in the hand, iron your thread. Repeat this process 3 or 4 times to be sure that wax is distributed very well on the whole thread. To begin hand sewing, I make a knot. I make a loop around index finger in my dominant hand, and using my thumb and index finger, I roll thread of the finger. And using another hand, I pull the thread to tighten the knot. Now to decrease the opening and make the shape of cover more rounded, more three-dimensional, I pull basting thread. If you did basting as I did, sewing on the left side up, you should pull thread that is outside now, because it's easier to distribute the fullness with bobbin thread. I do it in 4 places, everywhere where basting thread ends. And remember to distribute the fullness evenly. If sawdust is falling out of the cover, try to put as much inside as it is possible. I start sewing by inserting the needle in the seam allowance. Thanks to that, end of the thread won't be visible outside the cover. To make the thread really secure, I make also 2 back stitches. And then I sew using draw stitch. It's also sometimes called ladder stitch. I'm left-handed, so I work from left to right on this seam. If you are right-handed, you start from right to left. To make the seam even, treat basting thread as your guide line. Also, I fold seam allowance inside to make sewing easier and make the seam allowance closed inside and invisible. First, make small stitch on one side of the opening and then make small stitch on the other side. Try to make lines created by thread parallel to each other. After taking few such stitches, pull the thread that the gap between 2 sides of the cover will be closed. After closing the gap for a few centimeters, I stop sewing and finish this part with back stitches and figure 8 knot. It's made by making a loop around your needle and then pulling whole thread through it. And on the other side, all steps are the same. I insert thread inside seam allowance and secure the thread in addition with few back stitches, and I start closing the opening with draw stitching. On this side I also stopped after few centimeters, and I will put more sawdust inside the hem to make it packed really fully, that there won't be any free space inside. Then I continued closing the opening with draw stitching. On this side I didn't cut the thread. remember to make sure that whole sawdust is inside. If it's not, you should squeeze it inside. And continue sewing until whole opening is closed. Remember to finish with securing the thread by knotting or backstitching, or even both, that it would be extra secure. To make the end of the thread invisible after anchoring it close to this finish, I insert the needle inside the cover and take it off a few centimeters further, and in this place I cut the thread. Thanks to that, the end will be hidden inside. I like it very much as it is very neat way to finish your seam. And here we have tailor's hem in the first inner cover. To make sure it isn't empty in one place and tightly filled in other, I squeeze it a little bit and try to distribute all sawdust evenly and smoothly, that aren't any bulk or such kind of things. And now I put tailor's hem in the outside cover. During filling your tailor's hem, it could stretch inner cover a little. So now you may find it a little bit tricky to put outer cover. You may need to pull the outer cover a little, but keep going until you put your hem inside the cover. And as we did before, you can pull basting thread as much as you need to fit this part of cover over hem and then start sewing. This time, as we don't need to put anything inside anymore, we sew from one side to the end to close whole opening at once. I squeeze my tailor's hem and roll it on the table to make shape better, make everything smoother and rounder. And also for that, I make a little bit of finish pressing from every side. And that's your finished tailor's hem. I hope you find this tutorial useful and that you could create your own ironing tool. If you want to get more sewing lessons in the future, please subscribe this channel. And until next time.